Welcome to NBF Presents, The Art of Translation. I'm Natalie Green, the National Book Foundation's Public Programs Manager. We're so grateful to those joining us this evening and to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for supporting NBF Presents. The National Book Foundation is best known as the presenter of the National Book Awards, which honor the best literature in America. In 2018, we added a fifth award category for translated literature, with an aim to recognize excellent literature originating in all parts of the globe, broaden its American readership, and seek conversation around international stories and perspectives in the US. Work that continues to feel incredibly relevant for the way we engage with the world today. The work of the awards fuels our year-round education and public programs. So far, we've visited libraries, colleges, book festivals, and performance centers in 40 states. The pause on in-person programming meant a reimagining of virtual partnerships. Tonight, we're thrilled to give a special hello to our friends at Metropolitan Community College in Omaha, Nebraska. We were able to get copies of Hurricane Season to students across campus, thanks to their dedicated faculty, which has inspired classroom engagement, book clubs, and so much more. Many thanks to Liz Kay and the rest of MCC's faculty, staff, and students joining us tonight. Free public programming and book distributions to students, public housing communities, prisons, and detention centers across the US wouldn't be possible without your help. If you're able to, please consider donating at nationalbook.org/donate. And now for this evening's program. Sophie Hughes and Fernanda Melchor will chat with Shuchi Saraswat on Hurricane Season, translated literature and global readership. We'll share the link to buy their book with gratitude to our season's bookseller partner, Loyalty Bookstores. Real-time live captioning is available and linked to in the chat, thanks to our captioner, Nearby Night, for joining us. We'll open up to a few questions from the audience towards the end of the program. You can submit questions for the authors directly into the live chat at any point during the event. And now a little bit more about our guests. Sophie Hughes has translated numerous Spanish and Latin American works, such as The Remainder, shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, and Hurricane Season, shortlisted for the International Booker Prize and the Dublin Literary Award, and longlisted for the 2020 National Book Award for Translated Literature. Born in Veracruz, Mexico in 1982, Fernanda Melchor is widely recognized as one of the most exciting new voices of Mexican literature. Her novel, Hurricane Season, was longlisted for the 2020 National Book Award for Translated Literature, and her story collection, This Is Not Miami, is forthcoming from New Directions. And our moderator, in 2018, she founded the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith and served as its director until 2021. She's currently a nonfiction editor at the literary journal Agni. And now let them take it away. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Natalie. And hi, Fernanda and Sophie. Fernanda, where are you joining us from today?
Hi, I'm in Puebla. It's a city in Central Valley region of Mexico, and I'm thrilled and excited to be here talking with you.
And hi, Sophie. Where are you joining us from today?
Hi, Shuchi. I'm in Italy. I'm in northern Italy, borderland in Trieste. And very happy to be here and grateful for the invite. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, National Book Foundation, for bringing us together here today from all our various corners of the world, and for all the incredible work you guys do in supporting literature. So we're here today to discuss the novel Hurricane Season, the first of Fernanda's books to be published in English in the US. Just a little bit about the book before we get into our conversation. Hurricane Season is set in the fictional village of La Matosa in Mexico and centers around the murder of a witch by closely following four characters associated with the crime. The novel's furious, vibrating language pulls you right in, up close to the violence in their lives and the circumstances which led to this particular crime. In a review for the New York Times, Julian Lucas writes, Fernanda Melchor has an exceptional gift for ventriloquism, as does her translator, Sophie Hughes, who skillfully meets the challenge posed by a novel so rich in idiosyncratic voices. I think that really, to me, sums up the power of this novel, which is that language, that very specific language that each of these characters embody on the page. So I just want to get everyone a sense of that language. I'm going to have both Fernanda and Sophie read for us. Fernanda will be reading an excerpt in Spanish first, and then Sophie will be reading the same excerpt for us in English. Fernanda, why don't you go ahead?
Dicen que la plaza anda caliente, que ya no tardan en mandar a los marinos a poner orden en la comarca. Dicen que el calor está volviendo loca a la gente, que cómo es posible que a estas alturas de mayo no haya llovido una sola gota, que la temporada de huracanes se viene fuerte, que las malas vibras son las culpables de tanta desgracia, decapitados, descuartizados, encobijados, embolsados que aparecen en los recodos de los caminos, o en fosas cavadas con prisa en los terrenos que rodean las comunidades, muertos por balaceras y choques de auto y venganzas entre clanes de rancheros, violaciones, suicidios, crímenes pasionales, como dicen los periodistas. Dicen que por eso las mujeres andan nerviosas, sobre todo las de la Matosa. Dicen que por las tardes se reúnen en los zaguanes de sus casas a fumar cigarros sin filtro, y a mecer a los críos más pequeños entre sus brazos, soplando el humo picante sobre sus tiernas coronillas para espantarles a los moscos bravos y disfrutar del poco fresco que alcanza a subir del río. Cuando el pueblo al fin se queda callado y apenas se escucha a lo lejos la música de los congales al borde de la carretera y el rugido de los camiones que se dirigen a los pozos petroleros y el aullido de los perros llamándose como lobos de un extremo a otro de la llanura. La hora en que las mujeres se sientan a contar historias mientras vigilan con más atención el cielo, en busca de aquel extraño animal blanco que se posa sobre los árboles más altos y lo contempla todo con cara de querer advertirles algo. Que no entren a la casa de la bruja, seguramente, que eviten esos rumbos y no se atrevan siquiera a pasar frente a la fachada, que no se asomen por entre los boquetes que ahora pueblan sus muros, que le cuenten a sus hijos por qué no deben entrar a buscar el tesoro y mucho menos acudir en bola con los amigos a recorrer las habitaciones ruinosas y subir la planta alta para ver quién es el valiente que se atreve a meterse en la recámara del fondo y tocar con la mano la mancha que dejó el cadáver de la bruja sobre el colchón inmundo. Que les cuenten cómo algunos han salido espantados de ahí, mareados por la peste que todavía se respira dentro, aterrorizados por la visión de una sombra que se despega de las paredes y que comienza a perseguirlos. Que respeten el silencio muerto de aquella casa, el dolor de las desgraciadas que ahí vivieron. Eso es lo que dicen las mujeres del pueblo, que no hay tesoro ahí dentro, que no hay oro, ni plata, ni diamantes, ni nada más que un dolor punzante que se niega a disolverse.
They say the place is hot, that it won't be long before they send in the Marines to restore order in the region. They say the heat's driven the locals crazy, that it's not normal, May, and not a single drop of rain, and that the hurricane season's coming hard, that it must be bad vibes, jinxes, causing all that bleakness. Decapitated bodies, maimed bodies, rolled up, bagged up bodies, dumped on the roadside or in hastily dug graves on the outskirts of town. Men killed in shootouts and car crashes and revenge killings between rival clans, rapes, suicides, crimes of passion, as the journalists call them. They say that's why the women are on edge, especially in La Matosa. They say that, come evening, they gather on their porches to smoke filterless cigarettes and cradle their youngest babes in their arms, blowing their peppery breath over those tender crowns to shoo away the mosquitoes, basking in what little breeze reaches them from the river, when at last the town settles into silence, and you can just make out the music coming from the highway brothels in the distance, the rumbles of the trucks as they make their way to the oil fields, the baying of dogs calling each other like wolves from one side of the plain to the other. The time of evening when the women sit around telling stories with one eye on the sky, looking out for that strange white bird that perches on the tallest trees and watches them with a look that seems to want to tell them something. that they mustn't go inside the witch's house, probably, that they mustn't walk past or peek through the yawning holes that now mark its walls. A look warning them not to let their children go looking for that treasure, not to dream of going down there with their friends to rummage through those tumble-down rooms, or to see who's got the balls to enter the room upstairs at the back and touch the stain left by the old witch's corpse on the filthy mattress. To tell their children how others have run screaming from that place, faint from the stench that lingers inside, terror-stricken by the vision of a shadow that peels itself off the walls and chases you out of there. To respect the dead silence of that house, the pain of the miserable souls who once lived there. That's what the women in town say. There is no treasure in there, no gold or silver or diamonds or anything more than a searing pain that refuses to go away.
Thank you. Thank you both for that reading. I love that passage, which comes towards the end of the novel, because the beginning of the novel begins in sort of this collective voice as well, of sort of seeing the town and the witch, especially seeing these stories of the witch through the many voices of the various townspeople, before we get into kind of each perspective in each particular story of the people close to the murder of the witch. And then it pulls back out again into kind of seeing the town. And so, Fernanda, I want to hear a little bit about what drew you to this story and this town in particular. What led you to create this town?
Well, I was just trying to make sense of my life in Veracruz, and at the same time, the beginning of this huge and terrible violence we start having in Veracruz around 2008, 2009, and that end up in, well, I mean, many people outside Mexico know about the drug against the war against drugs, and how it led to a great display of violence, really horrible violence, like dismembered bodies in the streets and shootings. And I just realized one of the beauties of translation is, for me, it's the ability now that to hear Sophie in English allows me to read in a different way my own book, right? Because in Spanish, it's like the words are engraved in my brain. So it's something that's done, and it's something given. I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it, but to hear in another language translated by Sophie's choices, for me, allows me to understand this material. And it just took me back right now to that time in Veracruz. And my efforts to trying to make sense of what was happening. And I'm not only talking about, of course, of this spectacular narco violence, but I'm also talking about the small, more hidden violence, everyday violences that we as citizens, me as a woman, experimented in growing up in Veracruz. And basically, this is just a way of trying to understand what happened. And it is true that maybe my background as a journalist had a lot of things to do, because, in fact, this story was inspired by a real story that I read in a newspaper, and how in a small town near Veracruz they find the corpse of a person who dedicated themselves to sorcery. They were a sort of a sorcerer healer in that community, and it was a story that was very poorly covered, in the sense that it was very sensationalistic, and it was filled with stereotypes, and normally in Mexico this type of news, sensationalistic news about crime, like this sort of true crime, Mexican true crime, can be really explicit, and it can be very classist and racist too. And I've always been fascinated with this type of stories, but at the same time, I hate the way it was written. I knew there was a story behind it, but I wanted to tell it from another perspective, in a different way. And most of all, I wanted to tell this story in a risky way, with a very risky language, like daring to incorporate the language of the abuser, the language of the misogynist, of violence, and using that to reflect a reality. And I think it was a journalistic task. At the same time, it was a fictional one, because at first I wanted to do non-fiction novel, a sort of in cold blood, and I've said this many times, but it was just impossible for me. I didn't have the material conditions to do it, to do that kind of task. So I decided that I needed to explore it from fiction, because fiction was another way of telling this truth that it was in nowhere else. I was hearing it or reading it.
And I think that being fiction, you were able to get deep into the psyche and into the psyche of some of these very violent characters, and also some not as violent characters, but who are, I'm thinking of Norma in particular, who's, sort of, you feel a lot of tenderness towards her, even though she's sort of trapped in the situation that she's trying to flee from, and maybe not the wisest of ways. You really feel for it. I think that your fictional, you can do that in a novel in a way that I think is harder to do in nonfiction. And I certainly felt there's an experience in reading this book that I think comes across in the language of fiction. And I want to turn to you, Sophie, and just ask a little bit about when you first encountered this book. What was the experience of reading it like for you? And what did you think about the task of having to translate it?
I actively went after the task of trying to translate. I first read it in around Easter in 2017, so quite a while ago now. And quite similar to what Fernanda was saying. I mean, she wrote it, I just translated it, but there is something mesmerizing about the prose that can invite the reader to kind of click back into the world with extraordinary speed. And when I first read it, I was at my mother-in-law's house, and I kind of sidled off to read for 20 minutes, without wanting to be rude. And I didn't come out of the room for like I think for 24 hours. I just read, and every time someone came, I'd come out for meals like a moody teenager. But I knew that I wanted to translate it, but then I really genuinely felt that I'd read one of the best books that I had read, for a long time. And certainly knowing that it was available to be translated and contemporary and by a writer whose name I knew, but that hadn't come into English yet. It all seemed, just like a dream job. But I was nervous as well. I was nervous to take on that job, because I felt that the prose poses lots of challenges, or at least I thought at the beginning, because maybe we'll speak about that later. But actually, when I got into translating it, I found myself it was an extremely compulsive activity. And I think that the more I translate, the more I've come to realize that actually the two things that you look for as a translator are the quality of the writing and then the material, the story. And I've become more and more increasingly interested in the story and how I feel just compelled to keep on reading. And that's something that I find interesting in today's world, where we're so distracted and struggle to read, a lot of us. And so I'm really interested in story in a way that perhaps I was used to be a little bit more interested in style, even though obviously Fernanda has a very standout and interesting style. But the quality of this writing just stood out to me. And as soon as I started translating, that process confirmed the quality, because I really didn't have to do very much work. I obviously had to choose all the words in English, but sometimes that task is a lot easier than at other times. And I did write a few times to Fernanda just saying, I don't know why I'm finding this so easy. Because I didn't expect to at all. I don't know why I'm finding that I can do this. And maybe just reading then, I realized that what happens when I read this book aloud as well, and it's happened at events before, but I haven't thought about it in these terms, is that I don't really falter as I read aloud, which I do, like every normal person. I haven't been rehearsing this reading, I'm just reading it, but I don't find myself faltering. And the credit for that I give to Fernanda. It was that gift of these, of these like beautifully constructed sentences. For a translator, that's all we can hope for.
Yeah, and for people who haven't read the book, there are paragraph-long sentences, and actually, I think there are very few paragraph breaks, and so you're getting pages of sentences that are just sort of in this rhythm moving along, and it has a very hypnotic quality to it. I love this one reviewer, Gabriel Iglesias. He said in his NPR review of the book that sentences that take up 2 or 3 pages sound like a horrible reading experience, but Melchor pulls it off brilliantly. I never felt lost or confused by her style, probably because the voices sound like a regular person telling someone a story instead of an author trying to impress readers with literary filigrees. So Fernanda, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the oral quality of the storytelling. And a lot of the characters are telling stories themselves, whether their chapters are written in the third person, but they slipped into this kind of testimonial way of speaking. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that oral nature of their storytelling and of their writing.
Sure. The language of the novel it relays a lot in an oral quality, in a direct, and direct, but like normal speech, like colloquial speech. And for me, it was the most organic way of incorporate and integrate a whole chorus of voices that I have been hearing for a long time. When I explain it like that, I think I sound like a mad woman. But actually, there is something. I actually felt like a ventriloquist writing this book, or like a possessed person, like a medium, like in the 29th century. I give these voices a space in my head to grow, to discuss the events, to develop, to contradict each other. And there were mostly voices of women. And I thought it was, at the same time, I was willing to make an homage of gossiping, like this way of talking that's very emotionally invested, and that it seems to be always developing and growing and expanding, and it never ceases. It was like trying to write in the way my mother and my aunts and my grandmother used to talk when they were together. And I wanted to take that material that was really rough, like, violence and hate speech, like all these negative and filled with hate discourses, and turn them into this form that feels natural for the reader. My intention was never to create artificially these long paragraphs and to show off how intelligent I am or how a technical feat it could be. But for me, it was so organic that the novel developed that way. And I wanted to create this sort of machine, this word machine that will go forward and forward and forward and unstoppable, like a natural force. I wanted to do that. And this is the first time I try it, because in my first novel, Falsa Liebre, it's a whole different story. It's another kind of narrator. There are direct dialogue. And here I wanted to incorporate everything. I want to put everything into, speech, thoughts, dialogue, narration, everything into one big mess that the reader could jump into and dive and lose themselves inside for an immersive experience.
And I had read somewhere in one of your interviews that you used a Veracruzian dialect. Can you talk a little bit about that in the Spanish?
Yeah, well, it's mostly a recreation, of course, because if I just, I don't know, put a recorder and record what people says and just put it like that in the computer, it wouldn't make sense. It will be even difficult for me. And I tried to create Mexican Spanish that was really, that had really lots of elements from Veracruz, but also had elements from, I don't know, my own culture and surroundings growing up. I mean, there were phrases and expressions that I don't even think anybody outside my social circle will use, for example. But I tried to put it there because for me it was a natural way of telling things. But at the same time, it's always a recreation. I was thinking all the time about what Juan Rulfo did, for example, while he recreated the language of the Jalisco campesinos. Nobody really talks like a Rulfo character, but at the same time, when you read a Rulfo character, you say, yeah, that's like how peasants work, how peasants talks in Mexico. And it's like he created a whole new language with the words that we use every day. So I was trying to do that with my own version of Spanish, with my own version of course, Mexican Spanish, but also Veracruzian Spanish. And in a way, there are some parts that even people from Mexico will have trouble understanding, and it has lots of elements of popular culture that didn't really even doesn't make sense in English. And I think one of the challenges, and Sophie can tell us more about it, is how to translate these sort of elements that make sense in a culture, but they don't really make sense outside. I'm talking, for example, bad words, curse words. In Spanish, sometimes they will have, of course, they are meant to insult, but sometimes there will be terms of endearment, or sometimes there will be just elements that are used to create this realistic speech, like marks of realistic speech, or sometimes I like the way it sounds. So I use to punctuate. Now I use a bad word just to punctuate. Like I'm thinking in English, like in rap music, these bad words that are just to make an effect. And there are parts of Hurricane Season that I think it's like rapping sometimes. The way it has to be read, it's like that. It has that rhythm and that force.
Yeah, Sophie, you had mentioned in a conversation that you'd had with Fernanda, actually, that one of your most important tasks as a translator was to make the characters speak and swear and rage believably. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that challenge, and specifically when it comes to swearing.
Yeah. So in terms of the dialect, as Fernanda was saying, there are like inflections of Veracruzian Spanish, and then kind of Mexican Spanish. I mean, I am familiar with Mexican Spanish. I think that would have been a requisite for any translator of this book. But when it came to swearing believably, I mean, the first thing that you do as a translator, in my case, is a first draft in which I try to render the original quite literally. And this is really just a first draft. It's a literary mess, but it's the way that I sort of make sure that I've set down what was there quite rigidly in the original to make sure that I sort of have my parameters to work within. And then once I've set my parameters, and in the case of Fernanda, once I've spoken to the author on the whole, I try to speak to an author. That's just my preference. I don't think all translators do, many do. I think it's incredibly useful because we know that there are certain things that translation must do to the original in order to make it a good piece of literature in the target text, no, in English in this case. And sometimes you would like to be able to ask the author, you know, if I have to lose something here, do you mind if I move away semantically from what this swear word means? Here, does it really matter that it pays reference to the mother, or that it's specifically a curse word that, you know, has to do with, you know, sex or sexual violence? You know, does that matter here more, or does it just matter that it would sound exactly as I hear your characters swearing, because it's spontaneous in this instance? There are other examples of slang where it or of the dialect where it's not so much to do with spontaneity, but, you know, there's no literal translation. You can't literally translate many of the sayings, almost all of them. But that's the joy of translation. I mean, translation is not there to try to do these things literally, or even neutrally, because it has to breathe with life, the translation, as it breathes with its own life and a different life, the original. But, you know, we're not magicians, translators, so we have to sort of see those limits and turn them into, assets, and turn them into kind of desirable qualities that the translation will take on. So, for example, with the dialect, with a lot of it being kind of Veracruz dialect, I couldn't render it into a Veracruz English, obviously. No such thing exists. There's no way in this book I could have left it in, I probably wouldn't have anyway, but I mean, it's littered throughout. I mean, the whole book is studded with dialects, so you couldn't do that. You couldn't leave lots of Spanish in. And so and obviously I'm from a place, and so I hear British dialects much more strongly and keenly in my ear than I would an American one. I was translating it contractually. I was translating for a British publisher, and then New Directions were also going to publish the book, and I knew that, and I was in conversation with both editors, British and American. I knew that Americanization process would go on, but I was clear to both the editors that with their permission and with their, you know, in agreement with them, that I would sort of plunder all the Englishes that my ear had ever come into contact with, because it seemed to me that that's what Fernanda had done. And you know, there were some readers who felt that that was like a mashup, but you know, you didn't ask, there was no retranslation for the peninsular Spanish reader of the Mexican, right, in Spanish. So I thought, it's okay. I just wanted the reader to meet the translation where they had to meet the original. And I was just reading recently, I finished reading recently, Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. And I was amazed because, you know, there's so much, it's beautiful, there's so much dialect, and it immediately thrusts you into this world, and you feel so immersed by his Glaswegian dialect in this original language English book. But I did have a Google before this conversation, because I thought, I wonder what comes up when if critics have mentioned this dialect, because they're words that I didn't recognize. And, you know, I only live I'm from an 8-hour train journey away from where he's writing from, and there were words that I really, really didn't know. And then I was thinking, but what did I do as a reader? Did I look them up? Of course I didn't look them up, because I didn't need to know. I didn't need to know what it meant. I mean, there may have been a word that I thought sounded lovely and beautiful, and I might have looked that up or asked a friend from Glasgow. But on the whole, precisely the effect that these words that you don't understand have is to keep you in the world, to stop you leaving the page, to stop you going to Twitter, but, you know, think you're going to your dictionary on your phone, but you end up on Facebook, you know. And that was one of the things that I loved about Fernanda's book. I felt that she'd given me this gift of just immersive reading after a long time of being too distracted. And that's what I wanted to recreate above all.
Well, thank you. I have a couple more questions before we move on to audience questions. And I just want to remind the audience to use the chat to ask your questions. and we'll try to get to as many as we can towards the end of the hour here. So I just want to return to, some of the translation choices that you have to make. Did you want to say something, Fernanda, by the way?
No.
Okay. So I just want to return to these choices that you have to make as a translator, and things that you can't quite translate. And then we've talked a little bit about some of the music lyrics that you chose to keep in Spanish. And so I wonder if you guys could both read for us, Fernanda, if you could read for us, and Sophie, and then talk a little bit about that process and why you decided to handle translating it the way you did. Fernanda, why don't you go ahead?
Ok. Los ojos de Brando se deslizaban, ebrios y dilatados, por la piel desnuda de las edecanes, por los rostros anónimos de la multitud reunida sobre las aceras, por las máscaras grotescas de los niños que surgían de pronto para reventar sus huevos llenos de harina y confeti contra las cabezas de los adultos distraídos. El aire ahumado de febrero olía espuma de cerveza, a grasa fundida de los puestos de tacos, a deliciosa fritanga, a caños y a basura, a los orines y las heces desparramados en las banquetas y al sudor de los cuerpos que se apiñaban en torno al suyo. La plaza de Villa estaba llena también de policías traídos de la capital expresamente para contener, aunque sin mucho éxito, a la turba que se remolinaba alrededor del trono de la reina. Una niña apenas, envuelta en tules y brocados como una princesa de otro siglo. Una nena de mirada perdida y sonrisa impostada que sacudía sus gráciles miembros al ritmo sincopado que tronaba desde la pared de bocinas a sus espaldas. A ella le gusta la gasolina, con una mano en la cintura y otra sujetando su corona. Dale más gasolina. Y aquella mirada vacía, casi espantada. ¿Cómo le encanta la gasolina? Por las obscenidades que los ebrios a sus pies le gritaban con algo más parecido al hambre que a la lujuria. Dale más gasolina, dispuestos tal vez a devorarla, a clavar sus dientes en aquella carne suave, pegada al hueso casi, si acaso los policías permitían que la reina quedara a su alcance.
Brando ran his drunk and dilated eyes over the bare skin of the parade showgirls, over the anonymous faces in the crowds gathered on the sidewalk, the scary masks worn by children who appeared out of nowhere to throw eggs filled with flour and confetti at the heads of the distracted adults. The smoky February air smelled of beer foam, of liquid fat from the taco stands, of delicious fried food, of joints and trash, of the piss and excrement slopped all over the sidewalks and the sweat of the bodies bunched against his own. The main square in Villa was also teeming with police brought in from the capital specifically to contain, albeit with limited success, the mob that crowded around the queen on her throne. A young girl wrapped in twill and brocades like a princess from another century. A girl with a lost look in her eye and a forced smile who shimmied her slender limbs to the syncopated beats blasting out from the wall of speakers directly behind her. A ella le gusta la gasolina. With one hand on her hip and the other holding on to her crown. Dale más gasolina. And that vacant, almost petrified gaze, como le encanta la gasolina. Frightened by the obscenities that the drunks at her feet were shouting at her with something more akin to hunger than lust. Dale más gasolina. Primed to devour their queen, to sink their teeth into her smooth, lean flesh, if only the police allowed them within her reach.
Talk a bit about keeping the lyrics the way you did in the Spanish in there.
Yeah, it's an interesting process to hear the Spanish read and then the English read, because obviously we've introduced a sort of break in the text in a way, but by the shift into Spanish, because it just flows as another clause in the Spanish. Although it's in italics, right, Fernanda? I think in the original, maybe
it's in italics. Every lyric is in italic.
So it's marked out too. I wanted to keep all of the lyrics in the book as in Spanish. Firstly, because translating lyrics, it becomes music can't really be translated. I mean, you can translate the lyrics, you can translate what they mean, but you can't really translate the significance of the song. You can't tell it really what kind of love song it is, or even if it's a love song or a pop song. whereas, and obviously, if you don't recognize as an Anglophone reader the words in Spanish, you're also not going to know that, but you have more of a chance of finding out if you do want to know. And it just seemed to me that translating them didn't feel authentic. There was like a hint of trying to. There was a hint of translation choice about it. Suddenly it appeared to me that would look like a translator's choice, more than leaving it in the Spanish. And in this instance, it may just be a generational thing. I'm sure there are lots of people who don't recognize the lyrics of that song, but that was a big international hit, that song. And so you can sort of imagine the MTV half-naked girls dancing in the video, and that juxtaposed with this little innocent girl being paraded around these hordes of drunken, mostly men, effectively, molesting her. That juxtaposition in the text, it occurred to me that in that moment, by leaving it in Spanish, I could maintain it for at least a handful of readers who knew that Dame más gasolina comes from that song, right? And that it also adds to the texture and to the rhythm as well. It's like it kind of adds more physicality to the scene, which is this carnival, pumping, pounding, too much, stressful for this poor girl, but incredibly vivid to watch as a reader as well. And I hope that came across. And then there are other songs where it was almost the opposite effect, where I felt that lots of people wouldn't recognize the lyrics, but that for those who did go and look, they would also see these like beautiful ironies that Fernanda's song lyrics, where she adds them in the book, they really heighten the poignancy of the moment. So, for example, you have probably one of the most violent and just despicable and incorrigible characters who works for the narcos, and he abuses and in terrible ways young women, and he has music blasting from his pickup truck that is the cheesiest love song about being a normal guy, me haré pasar por un hombre normal. And the irony implicit in that, I lost it by not translating it for the English reader, but I don't think it would have come across anyway without the kind of melody in your head. And so I just thought I'll give people a chance of being able to go and find these songs as well. And there are other words that we kept in Spanish, but very few, just that was my choice, is to not litter it with Spanish. The American audiences would have been able to handle more than British readers, just the cultural proximity, but and it being the second language in America and it not being the second language in Britain. But I didn't see it was necessary. Again, I wanted to keep them in the world of the book, and I didn't want people to be coming away thinking, "Oh, that's a Mexican word. Oh, I know that from I know that from Mexico. I know this food because it's Mexican." Because in a way, this book is not about Mexico, and that's what's special about it as well. I mean, it's about Mexico, but it's not. The setting is not. You don't mention Mexico, I don't think, in the book as a. You don't name it. And it just occurred to me that it could just become distracting because it is about violent crime. But to me, it's also a novel full of heart and tenderness and compassion. And that it seemed to me that by making more of a thing of it being like Mexican crime, Mexican violence, Mexican misogyny, it felt like I was imposing that on the text by maintaining too much Spanish for the American reader. So we kept things that I just couldn't translate, like fonda. You could translate it, but it occurs so many times in the novel that I would have had to sort of explain it as a thing that it not quite is in English. So I kept it as fonda. But yeah,
I think that's such an interesting point too about not pulling the reader out, because this isn't a novel that's asking for an active engagement for the reader. It doesn't have a lot of white space where the reader is supposed to sort of bring themselves in. It really is presenting these characters to you fully and into their minds, right? And so in that way, yeah, it's not about the country, or it's not about it's not, you're not supposed to create kind of that nonfiction application of this is what's going on at this time in this place of the world, part of the world. It's supposed to really get you into into kind of the ugliest part of the mind and the body and the way we are with each other. And I just, before I go to the questions, just want to say that Fernanda, to me, that's one of the real beauties about this book, is there is no sort of kind of grand theorizing that's going on here. It really is about these characters and getting as close to them as possible. And I really appreciate that that you've gone to these dark places to do this work with this character, to bring them to the page in this way. I really appreciate that about you as a writer, and I'm grateful that you were able to get so much of that across in the English for all of us, Sophie. So thank you. I want to just move to the audience questions. We've got a few coming in here. For Sophie, what was it like to translate the pacing of Fernanda's writing?
The pacing, yeah. It was actually really helpful in practical terms, because there were very few full stops, so it's hard to stop. It's like, you have to get a certain amount of words translated a day and keep going. And so that made it really compulsive. Pacing wise, English doesn't really want to stretch as far as Fernanda. If I translated the clauses, if I kept things syntactically as similar as possible in the English as to how they are in the Spanish. English doesn't really like to be stretched that far, but nor does Spanish. Fernanda this is a stylistic device, if you want. Like, it's a stupid word to say device when Fernanda's just said this is just how it had to come out, but for want of a better word, like that's also true for Spanish. So there are places where the grammar stickler in me wanted to put full stops or harder stops, but didn't, and I went with it. And I hate comma splices, when you have a comma where it should be a harder pause. And but I've really come to see that sometimes just keeping on rolling on, if you're patient as a translator, and if you keep looking at the pieces of the jigsaw and doing small tweaks here and small tweaks there, English is much more flexible maybe than you first think it is, just because you're taught how to write in a certain way with certain rules. And that's one of the joys of literary translation, is that you get to pretend to, you get to try out the styles. You have to be flexible. You get to try out the styles of different authors and see how they create different effects with their writing, and emulate them and try to live up to what they've produced.
Thanks. And Fernanda, this is for you. I loved the way that the multiple perspectives and voices worked to deepen our empathy for every character as the novel went on. How early in the writing process did you arrive at this approach? Did you have any literary models in mind?
Sure. When I always knew there were going to be voices, because I had voices in my head. So I wanted the prose to reflect this diversity of people, like to mirror this small community that was inside my head. I had to create a small community too. But I wasn't satisfied at first with my first attempts to write in the first person. A lot of these voices were written. I wrote hundreds of pages before coming with the final version of Hurricane Season, and there were versions that ended up in the trash can. And didn't really, I really didn't want to do this sort of while I lay dying sort of dialogues. I just read a Brief History of Seven Killings of Marlon James, beautiful and grandiose book, but I really didn't want to do that, to explore each voice separately. I wanted to find a way to to be able to talk of them in the third person. I wanted a classic sort of omniscient narrator. So it was a really long search for this narrator that could integrate all the material and the voices and the traveling that it's necessary to tell the story. But from the very beginning, I always thought that each chapter should be dedicated to a different character, except the first one and the last one. The first one is just like, it's a little homage to Cormac McCarthy in this awesome and horrific novel to A Child of God. And it's a homage to the beginning. I just wanted an image, the children finding the corpse. And the second one is like the town coming to life and speaking in different kind of voices. And then there's a concentration in each character. Yeah, you focus in each character. And at the end, in the chapter we read at the beginning, that piece that mirrors the second chapter, it was my attempt to go back to this sort of collective voice. Of course, it's very different because when I got to that point, writing and revising, I was emotionally depleted and super tired. I just couldn't reproduce that voice anymore, so I sort of changed it. That's the only chapter where there is paragraphs, for example, where there is full stops, and I just wanted to go back to that like flux of women voices talking about what happened, about the story of the witch and the end of that story. And it was I was inspired too by Svetlana Alexievich's accounts. For example, in Voices of Chernobyl, I just read her thanks speech for the novel, where she talked about how when she was a little girl, she will go out the outsides of the community, and all the women who came back from work just will stop there and have a cigarette and smoke and tell stories about the war. And she began her work of gathering discourses and stories and intertwine them. I'm sorry, I'm inventing verbs. I'm making up verbs.
No, you're not.
Okay, I always think I do it. And how Svetlana Alexievich is like this great DJ of stories told by other voices, right? And I wanted to do a little bit of that feeling at the end of hurricane season. And the last chapter is, well, that was a solution I needed to give the story of the witch an ending that was as compassionate as I could, given the story and given the whole variety of violences that are there. I wanted the reader to say goodbye to this story and to this universe in a more kind way, because the whole novel, I mean, it's a whirlwind, and it's like somebody grabs you by the neck and slap you all around. So I just wanted something quieter and dignified for this person who was the witch and who suffered terribly all along the novel.
One final question for both of you. This is someone asking for advice. What advice do you have for ensuring a successful translator-author collaboration? In particular, how do you build trust and openness on both sides and communicate your expectations and concerns?
Shall I start? Yeah, because I was looking back today at some of my and Fernanda's early emails. And so here's an example of, so what I try to do is write to authors when I know I'm going to translate their work, or beforehand if I'm interested in translating their work, and just talk to them about the book and just find out, a little bit more about the intentions behind the book. No, like George Steiner said, that to translate is to hear significance, but it's also important what was significant to the author too, because you're not going to be able to retain everything. So I spoke to Fernanda about translating hurricane season, and I must have said something along the lines of, look, there'll come times where I have to sort of choose between semantics and rhythm and the music and the meaning. I'll always try to stay as close as possible, but this is what translation is. It's not just a crossword. There's no neat answer. Then you have to do the molding to make it sound right. And Fernanda's ear, she's got an incredible eye, so she sees things. The level of detail in her writing is amazing, but her ear is astounding as a novelist, and it must be to do with it being a journalist too. But I wanted to live up to that challenge. I wanted to have that ear like she has. So I wrote to her asking, what I should do in those cases. And she wrote back saying, I fully support your parameters and choices. I've always thought Temporada de Huracanes is more about rhythm and cadence than literal meaning. I think I'm more interested in pace than in accuracy, because many passages in the book were written to sound good, to elicit an emotional response, not only through meaning, but through cadence. So if beep sounds better and provides a more rhythmical pace than beep, for example, just go ahead. And then later on, I was asking her some questions in the final moment, just before I delivered the work, where you always get terrified you've made a mistake, which I did actually in one issue. That's another issue. It's been fixed now, it's been corrected. But and she wrote back just saying, no hay preguntas tontas. There are no stupid questions, because we were getting down to levels of details that were just tiny, that seem insignificant, but that matter to most translators. So trust, it's a very long way to get back and say, having the trust of your author means the world, because you're stuck within the parameters of the book, but you need freedom to within those parameters to make it into a work of literature.
Yeah, I mean, you need to trust your translator. It's a necessity. I just signed the Croatian translation, and I only speak Spanish. I sort of speak English. I can read and understand pretty well French, and that's it. I mean, to Icelandic and Croatian and Russian and Arabic, I will say in Mexico, you just commend yourself to God and whatever that has happened, and let anything can happen, and you won't even notice. What happened with Sophie, I think it's that all these her questions, her involvement in the whole process, the way that she works, and the respect she feels for the original text, and at the same time her willingness to find solutions, creatively find solutions. For me, she just won my trust. Of course, is for me, ideally, I know it doesn't really happen sometimes, and most of the times in reality, but ideally the translator, it's a whole another author. The translator must be capable of inventing new ways of transverse that text into another one. And in my case, I wrote Hurricane Season. I never expected, never ever, to be translated to English or to any language. I mean, it was a novel I wrote out of necessity, of my own emotional necessities. And I never expected to be a huge success as it is in Mexico, and a success as it is too in the world. So it came totally as a surprise, and I just feel so grateful to have Sophie by my side, because English is so important. It is not only that I will be read by Americans or people from the UK, but also from Australia and from all over the world. That's the thing with English, and I just love it that it's not. I don't know. Me as a Mexican, we have a closer relationship with American English, for example. So many of the bad words in the courses, I in my head, they sounded, American. But I just love to hear them and to read them into a whole another variety of English, because I'm always trying to defend Mexican and Latin American varieties of Spanish. And I think it adds in richness to the novel, of course.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are just about out of time. I want to thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. And I'm so excited that you're going to be translating more of Fernanda's work, Sophie. So we have more to look forward to. And I thank the National Book Foundation again for bringing us together in this space. It's really an honor for me to be here with you both. And to our audience out there, we can't see you, but very appreciative that you're here and asking such great questions and reading Fernanda's book. Thank you, everyone. And if you haven't read it, I believe the National Book Foundation has put a link in the chat to places where you can purchase the book from. So please read it. And thank you. And thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Shuchi.
Thank you so much. Take care.